Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids, and we're back for some more Gwent, and today we're playing the new Power Shift Seasonal event, which is an alternate game mode in which every unit in our starting deck gets its power set to its provision cost. That means that cards that would normally have weak power are suddenly much stronger. Today we're trying a new kind of deck that I'm excited to show you, so let's go give it a look. So today we'll be playing a Scoia'Tael Precision Strike Hyperthin deck. The first time that I've ever given you guys a Hyperthin deck. What is Hyperthin? It's a deck loaded with a bunch of cards like Roach, Knickers, and Aelirenn, all of whom will get summoned out from our deck if we meet certain criteria. And if we summon out all the cards that we are trying to thin from our deck, then that actually means that we will use every single card in this deck through either playing or summoning. And because of that, that means we can go without using basically any tutors, which means we're spending all of our provisions on our units, which is significant in this event because provisions on units means points. So the great thing about this deck is at least the overarching idea is very simple. Summon out all the cards that you can. So first one is easy because Roach is going to come out whenever you play a gold card, and that's going to happen without even needing to think about it. Similarly, Knickers takes little to no effort because he's going to randomly hop onto the board at some point during the match. Then we also have the Mahakam Volunteers, so we'll want one of these in our hand and the other one in our deck, so that as long as we already have a dwarf on the board, when we play the Mahakam Volunteers from our hand, the other one will come out from our deck. Then we have our leader ability, which after using 3 charges of damage, will create a Brokilon Sentinel, which, as long as that 2 damage that it has destroys an opposing unit, it will summon out the other Brokilon Sentinels from our deck. The one that we create from our leader ability will only have 2 power because it's technically not in our starting deck, but the ones that are from our starting deck will be up to 4 power, making this one of, if not the strongest leader ability in this event. Then lastly, we have Aelirenn, who gets summoned from our deck if we control 5 or more elves, which is probably the trickiest one for us to trigger, because although we do have a lot of elves in this deck, it is not a 100% elves deck. So just keep in the back of your mind that if you are starting to play some elves in a round, you might want to make a point of getting to that 5 elf threshold. Otherwise, you might get stranded in round 2 or round 3, wanting to get Aelirenn out from your deck, but not quite having enough elves to do that. So any of those cards that we're trying to summon out from our deck, we don't want to have in our hand. That's why we're using Curse Scroll as our stratagem to help us fine-tune our hand if necessary. Otherwise, you're going to want to mulligan out those cards in between rounds. So other than that, we poured all of our provisions into some really big units like Filavandrel, who starts as a 12, which means do not play him in the melee row because there are not any Scoia'Tael special cards that cost 12 provisions, but if you play him in the range row, you can potentially use any Scoia'Tael special card. Then Simlas is actually another way to thin additional cards out from our deck. In this case, we'll be playing either both of our Waylays to give us damage and spawn in Elven Deadeyes, which is a great way to get to that 5 elf threshold for Aelirenn, or alternatively, Red Haze, dealing damage to adjacent units, because there tend to be a lot of big units in this event. This does mean that you also want to make sure that you either have both Red Hazes or both Waylays in your deck when you play Simlas, so that you play both copies with Simlas. So that is one more thing to be mindful of when you're choosing your hand. Then we have Geralt to destroy our opponent's biggest cards, because, again, there are a lot of big cards in this event. Then we have Schirru, who actually got a huge buff in the most recent patch, because he will destroy any other card that has the same amount of power as him. He used to destroy himself as well, however that is no longer the case. Remember, in this event he will start as a 10, and there are lots of powerful 10 provision cost, and therefore 10 power cards, that your opponent might play. Just be mindful that although he will not destroy himself, he can still destroy any other 10 power cards on your side of the board, so just be a little careful about that. Then we have Gabor Zigrin that we'll probably want to play in the melee row to get resilience. This is one of the dwarves that we might have on the board to enable the Mahakam Volunteer thinning. Then we have Milaen, another elf to help summon Aelirenn and gives us a bunch of damage. Toruviel, another elf, also with a ton of damage. Ideally, you'd wait to play her relatively late in the round until you have an Elven Deadeye, so basically enable her with Waylay, then play her. Most of our cards deal damage on deploy, which means our opponent needs to have a unit out there. However, if you're going first or your opponent does not yet have a unit on the board, then the Sorceress is a great option, as is the Vrihedd Vanguard, likely in the melee row to get boosted based on how many elves we have in our hand. And then we have the Dwarven Skirmisher as another potential way to enable the Mahakam Volunteers, and since he starts at 4 base power rather than 1, he is significantly stronger, and since most units are going to be a lot stronger than 3 power, it should be pretty easy to trigger his ability and get the boost. Then last, but definitely not least, if we succeed in thinning out all those cards that we talked about, that means at the end of round 3, we will have no cards in our deck, which means if we use Decoy on a unit, the only unit that will be in our deck to replay will be the one that we use Decoy on. So that means that Decoy is a guaranteed way to play a unit twice. So this might mean Geralt if your opponent has a few big cards that you want to remove. It might mean Filavandrel for another Scoia'Tael special card, Milaen or Toruviel for damage, or maybe even the Sorceress. So there's a look at the deck, and like I said, it is a hyper-thin deck, thinning out all of the cards from our deck, allowing us to pour all of our provisions, and therefore all of our power, into our units. So let's go see it in action. Alright, so going up against monsters here, and they'll go first. Okay, so we've no outright brick in our hands here. However, we do have Simlas, which we would use to either play both copies of Waylay or Red Haze from our deck, and since we have one of each in our hand right now, we'd like to get rid of one of them. And so now we can use Waylay with Simlas and get both copies, so that's ideal. So I think we stick with this in that case. Okay, it's a Slizzard first. So what with them being Overwhelming Hunger, I think they are almost certainly a Death Wish deck, of course. So we're probably going to see Ruhin and or Detloff True form. So Red Haze could actually become quite useful here. And this Slizzard is quite important. To tell you what, maybe we start with the Dwarven Skirmisher here. Deal some damage to it, and we might even want to use a leader ability charge to finish this off before it can consume something on their next turn. I think we do. It's going to make it a little bit harder for us to get the death blow with the Brokilon Sentinel that we get from Precision Strike, but we're hoping that's still feasible, because we could do that right here, right now. So let's go Vrihedd Vanguard, boosted based on the number of elves in our hand, which is actually not that many, but now we go Precision Strike, because we deal 2 damage, then get the Sentinel out, and take it out with that, and get Knickers as well, making it much harder for them to get their consumption happening without sacrificing their leader ability. Well, they've got Barbiazi, so they were prepared, but we've slowed them considerably, so we could go with really any of our dwarves here. I think we might even go Gabor Zigrin, because I don't think they're going to be able to destroy him. And it gives us some resilience. It gives us Roach as well, and then he can get a little bit more boostage if we play the Skirmisher and or Mahakam Volunteers soon thereafter. Oh, it's Vi! Okay, not the kind of Death Wish I was expecting, but it does mean that Red Haze, yes, could be very, very relevant. So now let's do Mahakam Volunteers for the thinning. And the little boost on Gabor Zigrin. That might even be the last card we want to play in this round. We'll have to see how they respond. Presumably, it's another way to get Vi, and they'll consume it with Barbiazi. Yep. There's Vi. So obviously Vi costs a whole bunch of provisions, so it does start with a lot more base power. That gets them up to 42, but it's not yet enough. We know we've gotten rid of both of their Slizzards. They don't have any more of those. Barbiazi is out of charges, so that can't do any more consumption. They do have a couple of leader ability charges remaining, but maybe we can actually push a little bit more, bleed one of those charges out, making it much harder for them in round 2 or round 3, because we did so much to shut down their consumption early. So why don't we go with another Dwarven Skirmisher here? It's a little bit of damage, a little bit of boost on both you, and we'll certainly maintain our lead here. And this is obviously going to be Vi. They're going to have to use a leader ability charge to consume it. They do. And they still haven't caught us. Ooh, so this is getting really interesting. Especially because if we play one more card, force them to play another card to catch us, they play Vi, use their last leader ability charge to consume Vi. One of those big units is going to have to be next to one of these other big units, making this Red Haze a huge play. So I think we go Sorceress in anticipation of playing another card on our next turn. Otherwise, if not, we win on even. Royal Decree, presumably to get Vi, although they could potentially even try to get a consuming unit here. They go Quacks. Okay, so that's definitely going to be to get Vi. That is kinda unfortunate because, well, it does get Filavandrel out here. I mean, he is still 12-point body, but of course we would like to get the chance to use his order ability. That's their last leader ability charge. But the other thing is that Quacks now puts a 10-power unit in between these 23 and 26-point units, so Red Haze, not quite the value we were looking for. It's still pretty darn good by Red Haze standards, but I was hoping for a huge one. So let's go with the Sorceress. And with that, Bountiful Harvest into, not great options here. Not great options here, I'm afraid. And then, yeah, we'll go Red Haze. It was potentially worth waiting to use it, but it is just the right amount for us to retake the lead here. And they're out of leader ability charges. So this means they're going to have to play Vi here and not consume it. If so, then that means it will not go back into their deck. Going through all of their tutors right now. Yes, to get Vi. But at what cost? Because even if they do win the round, if Vi ends the round on the board, it does not trigger Vi's Death Wish. It will not go back into their deck. Their entire deck is broken. So I think we pass here. We'll give them the round 1 win in that case, because I'm not sure they can do much else here. Unless they use the Barghest to consume it. Okay, so they have to go 2 cards down. That's the sacrifice they have to make. Okay, and one reason why I was thinking about maybe using Simlas instead of Red Haze in that round was because we had already gotten a bunch of elves on the board, so we were about to summon Aelirenn. Now it's going to be a little bit trickier because we've played many of our elves, so we obviously want to get rid of her. And we also want to get rid of Waylay, because that's now going to be the target of Simlas. And we still have a card on the board here, so we don't need to play anything if they do dry pass, and they do dry pass. So that means we will have 2-card advantage in round 3. And although they may have a big Vi, we still have a Geralt to get rid of one of those big cards. So that should certainly help. Okay, however, it means we did not have as much time to thin out some of our cards here, so we still need to get rid of Waylay. And Aelirenn, we need to gauge if we're going to have enough elves to actually summon her. 1, 2, 3, 4. We should still be able to do it. Okay, there's Red Haze. Now we dump you. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Okay, so we're going first, in which case let's start with either the Sorceress or the Vrihedd Vanguard, since they don't need targets on the opposing side of the board to do their thing. And the downside of that Vanguard is actually that at 10 power, Schirru would destroy it. I'm not sure if we're going to use Schirru, to be honest, since the Vi is certainly going to be a lot bigger than 10. But that's Desert Banshee may be where they need to get their consumption from. So I say we probably go Milaen here and destroy it, because that might significantly handicap them. Because they've already used all their leader ability charges, and they've played many of their consumption units. There's Vi directly from hand. Does, of course, though, trigger Barghest from Haunt, because Vi is, of course, a Death Wish unit. So our biggest answers are Geralt and a Red Haze. Of course, Red Haze does require that they play 2 of those big cards next to each other, which, having Haunt on the board, they can put one of them on this side, one of them on this side. It does make it a little bit tougher. If they're smart, they may be able to dodge this. But now let's go Sorceress of Dol Blathanna to give her time to use her order ability on her next turn. Ooh, but they do have damage. And they have dominance, so not only is it the 2 damage on deploy, it's also the frost, which is significant, because that drops her down to a 2, where she can no longer use her ability. Did not see that coming. And so now I think we want to save Geralt, and we want to save Red Haze until as late as possible to see what our best option for removal might be. So let's play Schirru. I don't really think we're about to use him, because it would backfire. But he is, at the very least, a 10-point slam. And we're close to getting to 5 elves, which would summon out Aelirenn, who is the last unit remaining in our deck. And once we do get her out, that means we can use Decoy to replay any card we'd like, including, potentially, Geralt, which would obviously be amazing. So I think now might be the right time to use Simlas to get Waylay, and we'll use that to target the Barbaghyazi, because if we put both of those on this, we can get rid of it, and sure, they still have 1 round of consumption with the Barghest, but the fact probably still remains that the more consumption units that we can get rid of, the better. And there's Aelirenn. So now we have 0 cards in our deck, which means Decoy will replay whatever unit we use it on, which again will likely be Geralt. That way we can destroy a Varghest, and we can destroy also their Vi, which I assume one of these last 2 cards is to get it back on the board. So Toruviel, not super helpful, since they don't exactly have many cards to damage, but I think what we'll do is we'll go for their range row, since obviously this Varghest is bigger right now. And we'd like to save the Geralts and Red Hazes and Decoys until as late as possible. Okay, so Nero, presumably to get Vi. Yep. And that will also trigger the last round of Haunt, but that shouldn't be a big factor. They don't yet consume Vi. Interesting. They did do a good job of putting Vi on one side of Haunt and Varghest on the other, so that's probably what they're going to do. They're going to use this Varghest to consume Vi, and then that makes Red Haze much less effective. Like, right now, best we could do would be hit a Night Wraith, and that's going to spawn more rats, so that really doesn't help us. But it's either that or it's a Geralt now, and in the interest of saving Geralt to destroy their 2 biggest units, I think we just play this bad Red Haze and settle for it. Yes, it spawns in the rats, so on net it's just 1 point, but it also would have been 1 point if we destroyed a rat directly. Speaking of Red Haze, that's their last card. Oh. Okay. So they didn't consume and replay Vi on their last turn there, which means, well, Geralt is going to have a field day here. They probably will not like this very much, but first we get rid of you. That is already enough. And then, of course, if we really wanted to, we could do this, and because there are no other cards in our deck, that means we guarantee that we replay Geralt and destroy Vi. And, I mean, we could use Schirru, but we won't, because that will give us the win. Alright, so going up against Nilfgaard here, and they'll go first. Okay, so we want to make sure that we don't have a Brokilon Sentinel in our hand. Same can be said for Knickers. Aelirenn is also a card that we don't want, however. Okay, they'll go with the Doppler. Which, oh. Okay, is just a 6. I mean, it can be solid in this event, since it does start with much more base power. But let's begin by setting up the Mahakam Volunteers by getting a dwarf on the board with the Dwarven Skirmisher. They'll go Fangs the Empire, and we don't care that much about that Skirmisher. He's mostly just there so that we can use Mahakam Volunteers here. We could, of course, play Gabor Zigrin first, and then he'd get a little bit of a boost when we play the Mahakam Volunteers. However, given how this is Nilfgaard we're talking about, they clearly have poison and potentially other things to mess with Gabor. Let's wait to play him until ideally as late as possible to give them as little time as possible to mess with him. So let's go with the Mahakam Volunteers now. Mostly just to get the thinning. I'll also get out Knickers. Then it's Iron Falcon Knife Juggler. They're going with a bunch of low provision cost cards here. And so if we wanted to keep this round really short, we could play Gabor Zigrin right now and stop right there. But perhaps if we go with Gabor, it'll get out Roach, and then if we use our leader ability here, weaken the Doppler, or the Fangs of the Empire, that'll give us our Brokilon Sentinel, which we can use to trigger the Death Flow to some of the other ones out from our deck, giving us more thinning and giving us a much larger lead. So even if we do pass on our next turn, they have a lot of ground to make up. Yenvo is unfortunate. So it does get rid of our Resilience card, yes. However, we still have this big lead here, and they naturally draw into the card that they just stole from us. And they'll get Knickers out from their deck. So I think we know what they're playing on their next turn. If it is Gabor, it's 9 points, which is still not enough for them to catch us. If they use their leader ability as well, then we may be tied at the end of their next turn. I'd rather save our elves for a future round and go to maximize our elf synergies. So it is an early pass here, but I am curious to see how they respond. They will pass as well, so that gives us the round 1 win. And now, with us having one more card than them, and having one round one, we at least have 3 throwaways, but perhaps more likely, we'd like to push here. The problem is, we have further bricked our hand, because having all of our potential Simlas targets in our hand is not ideal. So either we're fixing Simlas, or we're putting Aelirenn back into our deck, but unfortunately we don't have enough mulligans to set up both of them. So I think what we'll do is let's put the Waylays back, and we at least have a playable Simlas in that case, and worst comes to worst, we play Aelirenn from our hand for 8. We'd rather it not have to come down to that, though. Let's lead off with the Sorceress of Dol Blathanna or the Vrihedd Vanguard, since these cards do not need to have an opposing unit on the board to deal damage to. So let's go with you in the melee row to get boosted by the number of elves in our hand, because we have a lot. You're going to destroy it with Geralt. I mean, that's trading a 10 provision cost card for a 5 provision cost card, and Geralt is a 10, which means Schirru could potentially take Geralt out. If they have more 10 provision cost cards, then that'd be perfect. Remember that Gabor Zigrin does need to go in the melee row if they're going to try to get resilience on him, which means at the moment you need to go next to Geralt, which means great target for Red Haze. So let's go with the Sorceress now, because this is another card that doesn't need to deal damage to do its thing, because we might just outright remove Geralt. Okay, Devil's Puffball. Oh, to get Madoc. Also a 10, yes, which means also destroyable with Schirru, but of course, Madoc can get out from either their deck or their graveyard whenever they play a bomb, so that's not so meaningful in that case. Let's go with our other Sorceress in the other row, and we'd love to have time to use this ability on our next turn, and hopefully boost up this Sorceress with her special card, except that's definitely not going to happen. Alright, this is not the way that I anticipated that we would use Red Haze, but we can use Madoc to destroy Geralt, which is good enough value that I think it is still worth it. Then here's Gabor Zigrin. Now, do they use Madoc? They do. Darn. That was exactly what we were saying we would like to have, would be Madoc right next to Gabor, or Geralt right next to Gabor, to take him out with our other Red Haze. We know that Geralt is gone, however, so it might be relatively safe to go with Filavandrel in the range row and see what special card we get here, because this is now one of our best point slams. And Call of the Forest might just work here if we use that to get Milaen and play her in the melee row, where she can deal a chunk of damage to Gabor. So that way, if we can't destroy him, at least he is significantly weakened. Snowdrop. Not in the same row as Gabor, so no Red Haze targets yet. However, of course, if they continue to play units, which they have to, then we're going to have something to go after. And what we could do now is play Simlas to get our Waylays, and those would be sufficient to get rid of Gabor, be slightly overkill in terms of the damage. One other thing to note here is that we are playing most of our elves in round 2, which means that it will become quite difficult to get Aelirenn out from our deck in round 3 if we don't just play her from our hand here. But as we were saying before, that might be what this comes down to anyway. So that is a risk that we're taking, but I think it is perhaps still worth doing. Speaking of Red Haze, they probably have 1 or 2 of those themselves, and we have a lot of big units on the board here, so I guess we play Simlas here, but that's still a 10 next to a 12, which is a little scary. Okay, then it's a Sire. This may be to get one of their, summoning cards out, namely Roach. And Leader Ability as well. And that does work well with Snowdrop, which means we have a decent Red Haze target here. We would love if we had Geralt right now, and it's theoretically possible if we were to use Decoy, because we've 4 units in our deck. Of course, normally Decoy would be our last play in round 3 when we don't have any units in our deck, so whatever we use Decoy on, we'd be guaranteed to play a second time. But that's another sacrifice we are probably going to need to make here. Also worth noting that Schirru right now is worth negative points, so that's a little scary as well. I think, as we said, it was unlikely that we were going to be able to summon Aelirenn out from our deck in round 3 anyway, so we might as well play her here, because she is worth enough points for us to force our opponent to keep on playing. And then it's Northern Wind, which will get Madoc back out. but the damage is not so significant. Means there is another unit out here that we could potentially use for Red Haze, but Roach on Snowdrop, or vice versa, remains our best option. For what it's worth, Schirru now would at least destroy Madoc along with Milaen, although they may still be able to get Madoc back. We'd like to save Red Haze if possible. Schirru still doesn't really work, but we might play him just for the point slam because much like Aelirenn, it is at least still enough to force them to keep on playing here. Then it's Letho, perhaps into a second Madoc? Yes. Okay. Solid point slam, yes, but it does mean that even if this last card is a bomb, Schirru suddenly does have a solid target to go after. They should activate this Madoc on their next turn and try to poke Schirru to get him down to something lower than 10 so that we can't destroy these guys, although we might be able to destroy Roach in that case, so alright then. I think that means we go Red Haze for Roach on Snowdrop. That gives us a couple of 9s on their side of the board. That way, even if Schirru does get a little bit of damage from Madoc's ping, then we might still have potentially a couple of targets to take out with Schirru. Let's go with that. We could use Schirru right now and get rid of these Madocs, but I don't think we want to do that in case this last card is a bomb, because that means they would resummon the Madocs, and Schirru totally would whiff in that case. Yeah, there is the Madoc, as we expected. They're trying to deal some damage to Schirru, so that even if they do play a bomb here and get the Madocs back out... No, it's Geralt Quen. I mean, he is a 10. Into Geralt Igni, who is also a 10, but is gonna destroy something here. Okay, Schirru did not get damaged. That's huge, because we use him, and we've already won. So, I mean, we can decoy, but I guess we'll decoy an Elven Deadeye, since it's not too much of a concern to lose that. And then, doesn't really matter who we damage here, we'll take the win. So there's a look at a Scoia'Tael Hyperthin deck for the new Power Shift seasonal event. If you liked the video, then make sure to hit the like and subscribe button, and leave a comment down below to let me know which other cards, archetypes, and factions you'd like us to experiment with next. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.